Hello, this is The Realm of Ideas is Free to All, and this is episode 11, Authority in Ideas. Thoughts as regard this as an indicator of societal health. Okay, so this is a series of talks I give, ruminations I'm using to kind of clear and clarify some of my thoughts regarding my work. And as a result, we've kind of gone through a series of different programs and usually anywhere between 15 minutes to half an hour. Some of them are real long, like last week where we ran a little long, but that was because we got kind of into some other things as we're transitioning from the previous group where we were talking about things regarding let's see, what were we talking? We talked about where were they? Okay, we talked about, oh yeah, we talked about, we started with an introduction. We talked about the operation of the metaphor as a kind of generative strategy, something that I discovered was a kind of valuable thing as a result of the fact that architecture had the potential to kind of borrow this mechanism which was a natural mechanism. We've always thought of the metaphor as kind of like something as related to language, whereas in fact it basically appears in language as it appears in many other things. There's nothing really specific to it language based. It's just a language formed, but it basically is an analog to other things that happen in other places. Then we talked about the nature of that, talked about it as an aesthetic thing. We talked about it as an organic thing. And then we talked about it as a kind of like a proto-metaphor and looked about that as kind of like something in kind of social realm. We talked about values of criticism, and then kind of, the nature of that, and then kind of filled it up with like how criticism was an indicator of societal health. Indicators of societal health are things that kind of take premises that we've kind of laid down historically, and it can be used as a kind of check to look back and kind of see how you've maybe deviated or kind of stayed true to your principles. So we talked about that. We talked about what some of those principles are. And then after that, we talked about architecture as a verb, drawing, and then towards an organic architecture. It was kind of leading more into my specific work as a researcher and an architect. So basically going from there, we started moving into the authority of ideas, which is what we're going to talk about today. Last week, we talked about towards an organic architecture. But the reason I want to start with this particular thing before we start going into it was I think that this is also an indicator of kind of societal reality that we have to contend with. And I'll begin by kind of talking about a couple of things. We talked about two unbreakable bonds. One was the relationship between technique and science, or more fundamentally, technique and reason-based discernment. And then we talked about the idea of criticism and its unbreakable bond with discernment and or judgment. So let me first talk about these things. I'll talk about judgment. I'll talk about criticism in terms of kind of a brief description. First is, criticism is the observation of by an individual as regards any circumstance under consideration. In its simplest terms, that's the way I believe it to be. Judgment or discernment, which is the other part of that unbreakable bond, is the ability of an individual to discern the consequence from information surrounding them. Now, that information can be criticism, that information can be their own observations or other things that they kind of think. But that information can come in the form of criticism, and I think we looked at that in terms of that having a societal benefit, which actually aids that other circumstance. And then a related thing, which we're talking about in terms of authority, let me talk about a brief idea of how I would define these things. Now, again, these are guidelines and kind of become more clear or kind of maybe more defined as we go. That which is generated for an individual by way of their ability to illustrate consequences regarding the circumstance under consideration. And it's done on an individual and an overtime basis. So my feeling is authority in ideas comes in a way of what I would call two things that we kind of see now playing out in public realm in terms of authority. My feeling is there's two different ways. The ability of an individual to be able to consistently over time discern and illustrate consequence of a circumstance is what basically creates their authority. Their authority comes from their ability to be believed by individuals that they can say things of consequence, that they can be persuasive, that they can find ways, not by manipulation or coercion, but by basically setting down observations that individuals feel have a mutual benefit or universal value, a consequence. We'll go into consequence and value more in further issues, but I mean in further shows. But in this case, we're just talking about that in relationship to this. So those were the two things we have. We have criticism and discernment, technique and science. We all have the idea of authority in ideas. So in the realm of ideas, which is what this is, an individual starts to become someone of consequence because of their ability to illustrate that authority. Is it the belief that is an individual can come into a circumstance and other people will say, oh, this may be interesting what this person has to say. You end up kind of seeing that that is the nature of the things that are valuable. And this person consistently comes up with things and says things of consequence. But again, just like an athlete has a good game or a bad game, has a career, these things kind of ebb and flow. There may be times as which an individual can do this brilliantly, and then other times they don't. And we make those decisions and we kind of, go around these things in order to kind of discern their value. So sometimes these healthy kind of like proto metaphors or unbreakable bonds allow us to kind of like move forward and make progress. Let me give an example. The one I always use, and I'll kind of go back to these things, is that in terms of like the idea of technique and science, in other circumstances, people's technique was wedded to superstition or religion or other kind of instances where these things work together, but we're not able to kind of like make the kind of technological advances or kind of move the ball down the field as was the case when technique became assimilated with reason. So what happened was when science and technology wedded themselves, the idea of being able to kind of take scientific principles and apply them to methods that could be used in engineering and other instances to basically be able to kind of like make predictions and understand better the circumstance, we were able to make greater advances. So in a very short time, we went from a series of circumstances where we were incapable of doing the simplest things to the point where we could actually have a situation where someone could stand on another circling body, circling the earth. Now, is there a moral component to that? There is. Is that a moral component that we can say is better or worse? Not sure. I think there is a certain value towards this as kind of moving us towards circumstance. Whitehead believes so. I tend to kind of at this point, given the fact that he has been an individual of great authority in terms of his ideas as relates to my own thinking, I see no reason to think that as I kind of better understand that, I would not come to kind of appreciate that totally as something he was capable of illustrating in great detail. I do at least understand the concept in terms of the current idea I have, which I'd say is more in relationship to Hume's skepticism program that comes out of Treatise on Human Nature. So at least in the case of like saying this individual circumstance or this individual thing has a value that I can use, and I use that example of, say, a map. I draw a map in order to kind of be able to kind of find my way to traverse my routes more efficiently, and by using certain methods to kind of like, trace landmarks and stuff like that. But going back to the idea before is that we would do funny dances and we would wear funny hats and we would actually even harm or murder other humans in order to do things like have a good harvest or have it rain and other things. So we actually murdered people in the name of things we had no idea if they actually would work. Now, again, to me, this seems incredibly foolish, incredibly ignorant. And again, I was not in those times, but I kind of feel as if like sometimes people want to kind of wax poetic about these things, and I see no need to. I mean, I look at it like when I was a less formed individual, and I kind of thought stupid things, I see no reason to kind of go back to a more primitive time. And by primitive, I basically mean things like not being able to discern from your circumstances any kind of substantive consequence. And I mean, that's the way I see it. I mean, I don't see any reason to kind of go back to the rain dance, because there's no evidence to support that the rain dance had of any value, except if there is a God in their world, he was probably looking down and said, like, oh my God, they're doing the funny dance again. Anyway, so as that, we kind of moved into this idea of like indicators of societal health as a check. And I bring up this idea of a check. For me, the idea of being able to test societal health comes from an idea that I feel is something that, in my reading of individuals from the 18th century, mostly Voltaire, Hume, Diderot, Locke, people like this, I came across the idea of the fact that there was a need and a desire to understand the fact that there was an incredible fragility to this sophistication that we had. And I think that though he could look back and say within a few hundred years ago, we were this and now we're this, we saw great distance. And I think this was I don't think I've articulated this like the way before, though there was this idea of the illusion of the distance that was gained under a short period of time, the speed of development of society as the strength of and tenacity of the continuity of that society. And that's something that these people warned about. I mean, the encyclopedia, as I've talked about before, was basically laid out. So in case we had a circumstance where we lost certain things, we would be able to go back and be able to kind of like remember them. Now, this is a situation I talked about, but this situation we have very much in evidence today. I talked about before about the fact that on my 10th birthday, on my 10th, the year of when I was 10 years old, I remember Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. I was 10 years old. I'm 65 now. We're coming up on another year where we will not walk on the moon. We will not have been able to retrace our steps back to where we once were. So again, that was an incredibly tentative hold that we had on that achievement. So can we walk on the moon today? No, we can't. So have we fallen below the horizon technologically in terms of achievement of 1969 with all our gadgets and our microprocessors and our AI and all these things? In terms of achievement, in terms of ability, yes, very much so. However, have we not gained in other avenues? Yeah. I mean, I argue with, especially with a lot of my kind of astrophysics friends, and especially my mechanical engineering aeronautic friends. It's like, we could do it if we wanted to. It's like, no, you can't. I mean, well, we couldn't redo it, and then they explain the problem. It's like, yeah, I know, you understand. I understand the problem. And again, one of the things I don't blame again, it's easy in their position to be defensive because they inherited a bag of shit, because other people lost their nerve. I mean, when we set out, after JFK made that speech at Wright University, it's like everybody in America said, like, let's fucking do this. And we were committed. And I remember, speaking to people who were in the space program in those golden years, they're like, yeah, we were ready. And we did what we could. But after the nation lost its nerve, wasn't like we failed. We didn't quit. We never quit. The country quit on us, right? The country betrayed us and like didn't let us continue to go where we had gone. Now, that's not the fault of the individuals. I remember, it's like I thought, by the time that I was the age I am now, I'd be living on a deep space probe. And I would, have left Earth and hadn't been on Earth in 30 years. And I would be in a position where eventually, as I passed into space dust, having come from space dust, I would just be projected out into the universe to disintegrate back into the dust that I came from. And to me, that was a beautiful idea, and I know that's not going to happen, and I feel as if like, it wasn't that I wasn't willing to do it. I wasn't willing to do what was necessary. I mean, and that kind of will become part of my discussion of where my architectural direction took me and how it got me to where I am. And as a result, I adjusted my trajectory based on the destiny that my generation and the previous generations, gave me. So in that regard, that was the case. So As a result of that, let me kind of quickly touch on some really brilliant work by two of my greatest heroes. I mean, Leonardo being my greatest, but two other heroes who I think understood this problem and basically gave us things to use as caution against this degeneration, this incessant desire of greed and selfishness and lack of will and lack of conviction to steal from us our destiny. So I'm reading from the very beginning of the Aims of Education, Alfred North Whitehead. This is chapter 1, the Aims of Education. Let me see if you can see this. I mean, this is like a heavily, I mean, this is just, I mean, this is a heavily annotated copy. I mean, I kind of think I've probably highlighted every word, at which point the annotations kind of become useless. But anyway, culture is activity of thought and receptiveness to beauty and humane feeling. Scraps of information have nothing to do with it. A merely well-informed man, and again, let me just correct this. He uses man because this was the societal circumstance of his day. So in our case, we would say a merely well-informed individual is the most useless bore on God's earth. What we should aim at producing is individuals, again, I'm changing from men, who possess both culture and expert knowledge in some special direction. Their expert knowledge will give them the ground to start from, and their culture will lead them as deep as philosophy and as high as art. So we have to remember that the valuable intellectual development is self-development, and this is mostly takes place between the ages of 16 and 30. So he's setting the foundations of his critique of the educational system, and he's already made he's already fired a shot across the bow. He's saying, hey, we have this tendency to kind of like fill people's minds with scraps of information. And he'll eventually kind of give a term to kind of talk about this thing. But he's talking about this and he's making a distinction, which in this case had a male and a female component in the society, but it's something that we still can see, even though we've kind of socially evolved, it's still very clear. And I'll lead to that something in the Portrait of a Lady. We have to remember that the value of intellectual development is self-development. Remember this, okay? As to training, the most important part is given by mothers before the age of 12. I still believe this is very true, or you do it yourself. As the case of Julie and I, we did it ourselves. The most important is to 12 to be teachable. It's saying due to Archbishop Temple illustrates my meaning. Surprise was expressed at the success in his later life of a man who, as a boy at rugby, had been somewhat undistinguished. He answered, it is not what they are at 18, it is what they become afterwards that matters. Okay, follow along. In training a child to activity of thought, above all things, we must beware of what I call, here it is, inert ideas. Okay, before he talked about scraps of information. That is to say, ideas that are merely received into the mind without being utilized or tested or thrown into fresh combinations. Now, we talk a lot about process. We talk a lot about the operation of the metaphor. We talk about, and again, you know, in Whitehead, we talk about the ontological shift from being to a state of becoming, a constant process of change. So that static metaphysical ontological circumstance that we talked about initially now is shifted, and now we start to think about processes, which is one of the things I start to realize. Which is why architecture becomes a verb. Architecture is the process of the creation of my persistence against nature, as we determined it. So in that case, my persistence of myself, of my society, is our architecture. And we can look at it and say, that's an example, that's an example, that's an example. These are crystallizations of these particular processes. So in the history of education, the most striking phenomena is that the schools of learning, which at one epoch are alive with the ferment of genius, in a succeeding generation exhibit merely pedantry and routine. The reason is that they are overtaken with inert ideas. Education with inert ideas is not only useless, it is above all things harmful, and uses the word corruptio optima pessima, which is corruption of the best is the worst. Except at rare intervals of intellectual ferment, education in the past has been radically infected with inert ideas. And this is the piece that leads to the other piece I'm going to read from Maeterlinck. That is the reason why, remember when he talked about culture? That is why, the reason why uneducated, clever women who have seen much of the world are in middle life so much more cultured the part of the community. They have been saved from this horrible burden of inert ideas. Every intellectual revolution which has ever stirred humanity into greatness and genius has been a passionate protest against inert ideas. Then, alas, with pathetic ignorance of human psychology, it has proceeded by some educational scheme to bind humanity afresh with inert ideas to its own fashioning. So we have this tendency to cripple ourselves with our own progress by not being consistent and self-observing. We lose the ability to self-reflect. And as a result, we become too brilliant, too expert, right? And as a result, we suffocate ourselves and we send ourselves backwards. So now I'm going to take this and show you a reflection of that in the piece that I read last week by Maeterlinck. Around her summit, reason, the purest that can illuminate a being, keeps watch, but it display only the grace and not the effort of light. Nothing appeared to me colder than reason. Now, to a man who's gone through a public education, reason may be cold. It may be because of this kind of like framing of these inert, useless things become an incredibly cumbersome, rather a weight than a wheel, right? So instead of a way to kind of use to create beauty and progress, right, and exquisite process and method, it just becomes a burden. Nothing appeared to me colder than reason until I had seen it thus play around the brow of a young woman like the lamp of the sanctuary in the hands of a laughing, innocent child. The lamp leaves nothing in the shade, but the harshness of its rays does not pass the inner circle of life, whereas their smiles beautify all that they touch without. So Maeterlinck understands, without maybe having ever read this piece, that idea that a woman who has been a cultured individual, a woman in general, has maintained that innocence, which allows her to be able to kind of still access her genius in a much more apt way because she's not burdened down. And I always love the painting, I talked about it last week, by David of Lavoisier and his wife, and his Madame Lavoisier, where he, in his status as brilliant scientist, right, is sitting at the table, and David shows this incredibly beautifully ironic statement about not just the kind of like frailty and frivolity of and vanity of men, but the incredible elegance, grace, and genius of women. Is that he's seated and he's there with his stuff and he's kind of understanding something. He seems to be struggling. And it seems as if his wife has come over and gently put her hand on his shoulder and has just explained to him the answer that he's been looking for. Now, Julie does this for me all the time. She's constantly figuring out what I'm doing. And as a result, like here comes the hand. There it is. It was so cool because the hand was there before you were. Yeah. So anyway, so that's what happened. Is like, now what happens is he's like, what did you just say? Oh my God, you figured it out. Now, I remember.
I look so skinny in the background.
I can't see you in the background. I can see only here. You're so beautiful. Look at that shoulder definition. Oh my God. What do you? Oh, you're cute. All right. So anyway, so now what happens is, I mean, I can remember it on two specific occasions where Julie has been the only individual who has been able to kind of direct things in relationship to the kind of deepening and understanding of my work and its very essence. And it's because of that. Now, to read on in Now, going back to Whitehead, let us now ask how in our system of education we are to guard against this mental dry rot. We enunciate two educational commandments. Do not teach too many subjects. Okay. But here's the important part. And again, what you teach thoroughly. And what he means by thoroughly is allow it to be a process-oriented object, right? Make it be something that exists. The result of teaching small parts of a large number of subjects is the passive receptions of disconnected ideas, not illuminated with any spark of vitality. Let the main ideas which are introduced into a child's education be few and important, and let them be thrown in every conceivable combination possible. Understand point of view, right? Which is what happens in the construction of the metaphor, right? Is that we find that by our perspective in relationship to objects and the objects in relationship to themselves, these can happen in physical objects, it can happen in societal objects, it can happen in any circumstance that we can kind of create objects. And that's what happens. So he's now saying, move from this inert ideas to process. And he says, it's already something that is innate in us. And he's illustrated that it's inherent in the nature of women who have not been tortured and tormented by education. And again, to finish up, what happens with Lavoisier is that as he is waiting, he's just asked his wife, like, say it again, I need to write that down. That was brilliant. She notices that someone has entered the parlor, and in her world of grace, of society, of elegance, of sophistication, she's like, hold on, my dear. Ah, Madame blah, blah, blah. Welcome. Because she feels it's important to be a gracious host. And what's interesting is that David has brilliantly shown this aspect of these men with their ideas and all their incredible kind of activity, are now on hold while these two women or whoever has come into the parlor have pleasantries. So science will have to wait. History will have to wait. Culture will have to wait, because elegance and grace, subtlety, nuance, and innocence and genius need to commune. I fucking love that piece. It's absolutely fucking brilliant, right? And I think that these two pieces very much allude to that. And this is not a sexist thing. It's just an observation of the time. I mean, David was able to illustrate this time, and I mean, we were in when Maeterlinck and Whitehead were able to illustrate these things. These things were kind of still somewhat new, but they were known, they were appreciated, they were understood. Okay. So now we come to the idea of authority and ideas, and as regards an indicator of societal health. I'm going to use as an example my particular vocation, because I'm about to introduce that in relationship to where I enter my architectural engagement and where it has taken me as a life's work. Now, in that case, I remember born in 1959, in the shadow of the World's Fair, in the shadow of Neil Armstrong, in the shadow of the World Trade Center, John F. Kennedy Airport, Queens, New York City, right? Middle-class family, immigrants, came from Scotland, settled in Brooklyn, moved to Queens, where I was born, Queens Village, right? Middle-class kids had horizons of dreams about walking on Mars. Now, most people saw the average working class person, if they existed in their toil, as not having the capacity to have and dream of great achievements. But now, every boy in my playground, right, when I proclaimed that I was going to be the first person to walk on Mars, told me in no uncertain terms, it's like, no, you have to beat me to it. So we all decided we're going to race to the tree and let's see who wins. Just the same way that Kennedy had gone to Khrushchev and he says, hey, man, race you to that tree. Khrushchev looked back and was like, dude, I have a head start. It's like, that tree's a lot closer to me. Kennedy said, yeah, but I'm a lot faster and I want it a lot more. Khrushchev was like, okay, you want to do this? Kennedy looked back and he said, like, yeah, man, let's do this shit. And that was the kind of stuff that I was born with. I was born with that arrogant idea of like, how do you know I can't do it? And I saw people do it, and I saw other people do it. And I came from a place where people did it. The one thing about working class people in Queens was you had to tell us why we couldn't do it. And that didn't mean we were going to listen to you, right? We just laid it to you. It's like, all right, man, okay, tired of your bullshit. Let's fucking race. Let's do this to the tree or to the hubcap, to wherever it was. But we loved competition. We loved going one-to-one, you know. We still do. I still feel like, hey, you know, let's do this one-on-one, you and me, right now. And that's the kind of thing that was a healthy thing that in and around New York City was an energy that could have been, given the horizon of dreams, what it was then. God knows what we could have achieved if we had been given a real chance. So, you know, we didn't. But the thing is, we can take what we have and we can kind of understand it. So in terms of like that, let me just give a quick overview of what I feel was the circumstance. And then we'll go into more detail over the next couple of weeks, because next week it'll be my past architecture, which will be my youth. Then my recent past architecture, which is my formal education and my work as a professor. And then after that will be the aftermath, organic design thinking, which is after I left architectural education and architectural practice and kind of became a researcher and started to go off on my own in my own direction. That was how that happened. Now, interestingly enough, there was an organic impulse in the United States prior to me deciding that this was a venture, and it was subverted. Now, it was subverted because of pettiness, because of bitterness, resentment, jealousy, envy. Basically, it was for a momentary circumstance. It was a victory of mediocrity over genius. And it set architecture back. But I was unaware of the fact that it was happening when I was a little boy, because I was seeing progress in other places. But by the time I got to school, again, I was just understanding architecture in terms of the formal education of an architect. But it was very much in full display by the time I got there, which I learned over the course of my own education and my education of others. And then at a certain point realized it's like architecture was going in one direction. I was decided like I have no need or interest in doing this. I'll just go in my own direction. So that was kind of how that happened. And now as that influence has kind of died out because it couldn't sustain itself, I'm starting to see a new dawn, and I'm seeing an activity where architecture is now becoming an exciting place again. But again, I think it's also because my own ideas are starting to kind of come to full maturity. So that circumstance came in, and it kind of like took the sycophantic impulse of a European architecture and supplanted it in America over the natural organic circumstance that existed here. And as a result, it kind of like reinforced itself for several generations until it died out because it had no ability to kind of sustain itself. With any circumstance. So that to me was an indication of a frailty in our society, that one individual and a series of other individuals who supported this person were able to subvert a positive progressive impulse for their own pettiness, vanity, selfishness. But the good thing is, as Richard Feynman says, nature cannot be fooled. So as a result, it was able to kind of be artificially supplanted, but could never really sustain itself, so it's died out. And given the effort that was put into it, it certainly lasted a long time, but it accomplished nothing and it could not sustain itself. And as a result, the people who kind of like were the minions or the whatever you would call them, when I would call this Euro fetish mentality. And it doesn't mean that anyone who's, kind of part of a European tradition in architecture is flawed. It's just that I think that there was an American tradition that was very, very closely tied to the political system in the United States, and that very much understood its nature and our nature, and had been capable of actually creating an organic, or at least the origins of an organic architecture. And now it was subverted. Ironically, most of my colleagues who I speak to about organic architecture who are actually doing things are doing these things in Europe. And I kind of find that interesting because it's like something that I think, but I do believe there's an American organic architecture. But I think that one of the things we're seeing is that move towards this. So again, this was an indicator of societal unhealthiness, of a societal decay, where subversion of these main ideas of authority came to subvert a very healthy impulse. Now, what I think is the case, and I make this, I think very simple distinction, which may be oversimplified, but I feel it's useful, is the difference of the authority of the argument as opposed to the argument of the authority. Now, the authority says you have to do this. Now, in that case, the authority doesn't have to explain to you why. They just simply say, if you do not do this, you'll be punished. Now, the authority of an argument, right, is to basically make a circumstance identifiable through observation in a way that discerns consequence that wasn't previously understood. So what happens is you say, you thought this didn't have value, but look. They're like, my goodness, that's something we didn't see. Now, again, one of the things that I think happens is, again, being a student of Whitehead, I don't see things as static. I see things as kind of things that are constantly shifting, moving within each other and moving forward. I see a constant becoming, right? Rather than things. And I think this metaphysical stasis has continued to kind of like confuse us. This idea of this will always be, that will always be. Nature doesn't do that. So it's kind of foolish for us to continue to think that that particular abstraction can be culturally appropriated and can, be of any value. It's always going to be subject to that idea that change is inevitable, and changes, and the understanding of that is what creates the idea of potential circumstance and consequence. So with that said, I think that's a good transition from the last one, where we were talking about the idea of the organic architecture and what was the circumstance. I've given a detail, a little bit of a kind of overview of the idea of why I feel that there was these principles were a way to kind of like understand this subversion and illustrate this subversion, and now realize that as time goes on, that we can kind of continue towards that impulse. I myself look back and I kind of see the derivative nature of some of my earlier work, and I kind of can't say I'm ashamed of it. I was just not smart enough to understand. Again, and I don't mean that the people that I studied with, some of them were fairly well recognized individuals. They were nice people, but I never really felt I never felt that there was anything that There were a lot of things that were uh, appreciated, but I never felt challenged. I never felt as if the interest and the issues that came to me were ever going to be fulfilled. And I saw architecture in a different way. So, quick overview, a quick illustration to kind of say the next three pieces of my past architecture, recent past architecture, and the aftermath. My trajectory is that when I was a boy, again, growing up in Queens, the World's Fair, rocket ships and planes and flying cars and toasters and all kind, everything was shiny, stainless steel, polished, fast, right? It was the stuff of adventure. You strapped on rocket packs, you strapped on, and you went flying. I mean, we just were ready to go adventuring, and not just, getting in a boat and strapping on and kind of like going across a river. We were going into the vast unknown, which, I mean, in the times of those times, the vast unknown, we hadn't mapped the globe yet. So but we were ready for that adventure. The people who had come back from the Second World War and the fathers who had kind of fought for Britain and the United States, came back here, and these men were men of adventure. They had done the world a great service. They had kind of, defeated a terrible enemy, and they made the world a safer place. And now they had time to apply themselves to hobbies, and their idle time before the advent of television or the growth of television, before it would consume them, allowed their adventurous natures to kind of manifest. Because I was never really a TV person, I guess maybe I kind of had already found that need to tinker and kind of like go outside and kind of discover. I mean, was maybe what saved me. But I think it was also the fact that my adventurous mind was just kind of filled with these dreams of places I wanted to go, things I wanted to see, and how I wanted to act, that I was just caught up in the fervor of this excitement. The horizon of ideas was tremendous. It was probably the greatest horizon of ideas the world ever saw. I think now we're kind of creeping back to that, where in my lifetime, someone who's alive today very certainly will be the first person to walk on Mars. That's quite true. And in fact, let me expand the possibility. I mean, at the time when they went to the moon, it was all men. I mean, there was like, let's say, I think it was 12 total, and I think there's 4 left. But of the 12 men who stood on the moon, they're all men, and they're all white. They're all Christian, I believe. Right? Now, I was white. I was, family was Christian. I wasn't necessarily Christian. And like, I was a man. But there were women who thought that it could be them, but it was still mostly you had to, I mean, if you were black, maybe you didn't know if that was a possibility for you. But if you were American, you thought that possibility was for you. Was that possibility for you to the same degree if you were French? Not so much. If you were British, not so much. German, not so much. But there was a slit, you could think about it. But I mean, again, I had that horizon of dreams. And we could probably, like, if, we talk about natural resources, I would like to know, is it possible to be able to ever discern a component of dream horizon as a indicator of societal health? Anyway, could a Indian person believe that? No. Could a Russian person believe that? Possibly. Could a Chinese person believe that? Probably not. Now, the idea of it could be a white man, Christian from the United States, is not guaranteed. And that's a good thing, because we've seen tremendous ingenuity in a lot of other people to kind of enjoy the kind of challenge of the competition. And I'm excited because, there's a certain national pride. I love America. America has allowed me to live and dream. So I want us to kind of, maintain that primary focus as the land of opportunities for limitless dreams. And we'll see. But I mean, it could be a Chinese woman. It could be a black man from France. It could be any of a number of people. Another thing is, it may not be a nation born program, it may be an individual program. This was another thing that was completely unheard of, and it's very exciting. I mean, individuals now own their own rocket ships. This is like the stuff I remember seeing in Bond villains and the Thunderbirds. I remember the Thunderbirds was that great show. I think it was a Jerry Anderson show, and this family of people lived on their island, and they had rocket ships. And anytime somebody got in trouble, they called them in the Thunderbird. Thunderbirds are go. And you just kind of like strapped in, you went down your little chute, you got in your rocket ship, and you're like, FAB, and you're like, and then there was like, this was the nature of what you believed. Space stations, right? Taking a break on a space station, kind of like it was a 7-Eleven on the roadside on a highway. I mean, and now let's go back to that. So maybe let's see who probably doesn't have that potential to be the first individual to walk on Mars, and what other planets are next, and what other places, what other adventures are there. There's so many adventures, so many possibilities. The horizon is coming back, it's rising, and it's good to see it rising in some places. But the thing is, unfortunately, as this circumstance of mediocrity kind of like continues to kind of struggle against genius, there will be this need to be cognizant of where those subversions take place, because we have found these unbreakable bonds that basically construct our society to be as successful as it has been. But as we remember, if we're not careful and if we're not paying attention, this could all slip away from us, and we could end up back in the forest, basically kind of running around like primitive apes, kind of like bashing each other, crushing each other's skulls, right? So we need to be cognizant. All right, so the realm of ideas is free to all, and it is to the benefit of all for us to maintain this. Thank you. I'll see you next week.